Hi everyone, thanks for sticking around. I'm gonna try and go out with a bang because that's a metaphor that Shahana gave me, which is great because I will be talking about metaphors today. And Stefan did a great job of setting me up because A, he talked about social representations, and B, he answered all of the hard questions about how to solve the media problem. So I think he did a great job. So we don't have to ask those questions of me. But I will say that as I was preparing this talk and as I was coming to Canada, this is actually my first time here in Canada, and so far it's been pretty great. Not sure if I want to go back. But a lot of my identities have become really salient. So one is I am the daughter of a Mexican immigrant to the United States. I was born there, but a lot of what we talk about has to do with the people in my own family. Two, my role as an instructor. So where I am at Nevada State College, we're a Hispanic serving institution, a lot of my students are undocumented. And so the day before the election, a student was joking that this was the last day he was going to be in class because if Trump wins, he'll clearly be deported. So we've had to allay a lot of our students' fears now that Trump has won. And finally, my identity as a social psychologist has been just through the roof, not just because I'm coming here to talk to other social psychologists, but because as the election was going on, I felt like I was watching social psychology in the wild. You know, it's like, oh my God, there's confirmation bias, and there's bias assimilation and attitude polarization, oh my God. And so I could see it all happening, but I felt very helpless about what I could do or say that might bring to light some of the biases and interpretations that I thought were going in the wrong direction. But anyway, I would like to share with you some of the research that I've been doing, looking at how it is that media representations can affect not just our feelings toward immigrants, but actually the policies and the people who enact certain policies because of those emotions. So I'm actually really glad to be going last today because I feel like I'm actually drawing from a lot of people's talks already, and I see a lot of overlap. So let's start with the obvious. Donald Trump started his campaign by denigrating Mexican immigrants. It was literally one of the first things that he said as he announced his presidency. My favorite part of his speech was not so much that Mexican immigrants are rapists and criminals, but that some, I suppose, are good people. So this implies that he doesn't actually know any Mexican immigrants, but he's imagining that some are actually potentially good. So beyond starting his campaign with this, he went on to promise to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border, as we all probably remember, saying that Mexico would pay for it. He also implied that he would deport 11 million undocumented immigrants. So not just build a wall to stop people from coming in, but also force people who are already here or in the U.S. to leave. And a lot of people miss this, but on one of the first Republican debates, he mentioned that what he would do is not simply deport people just across the border, but deport them so far into Mexico that they would not be able to get back. And this was not his original idea. This was actually Operation Wetback that had been done in the United States already, to send people so far that they couldn't get back, much like you might do with a pet that you wanted to abandon, right? Take it so far that it can't come back. So as Trump was saying these things, I couldn't help but wonder, is he the cause of some of the attitudes that we are seeing, or is he the effect of a discourse that we were already having about immigrants? So I'm going to argue that he's actually an effect. He's a culmination of a discourse we were having, at least in the United States, about immigration. So Stefan, we're drawing from the same theory about social representations, so I'm glad you've already heard about it today. These are the images and descriptions that create the common sense of society. In other fields, we might think of them as narratives or tropes or themes. So these are sort of the common language that we use, or the common images that we're used to about certain topics. And they're usually used to describe or prescribe norms. So they're usually what is happening before social media got crazy, or what should happen, And it's really important because they serve as frameworks for our social world. So very rarely are we making decisions based on purely objective information. It's getting interpreted through some lens. And so sometimes a lens becomes very common, and that's our social representation. So my research so far has focused on social representations of race. So I look at how it is that people understand what race is. What is it? Is it biological? Is it genetic? Is it social? How people understand their own racial identity, the groups that they belong to, the groups they don't belong to, and then racial inequality. So how is it that people understand why inequality exists and what we should do to address the problem? All right, in other presentations, I have asked people what they think of when they think of the United States of America, but I'm not going to do that here because I'm a little afraid of what's going to happen. So instead, I'm just going to say, the common images that we think of are things, of course, like the flag. For any of our countries, we think of the flag. We might think of the map of our country, the values, so things like democracy and voting. But we also think about what the people look like and what they act like within our society. So these are what we might think of as typical Americans. And I like to use these two people. Does anyone know who they are? No? Okay. They're two actors from a show called Nashville, which is focused on country music, which is a very American thing. But what I love about these actors is that neither one of them is American. So he is British and she's Australian. They do really great Southern accents. But clearly they were selected, they were cast because they look so typically American, which is white, in this case very young, sort of blonde. She's very doe-eyed, which is a whole thing into gender that I'm not going to get into. So let me just sort of talk about how I think, or why I'm using social representations. So they tend to activate related concepts. So even if you're not aware, if you are exposed to a certain social representation, other ideas come along with it. So for example, in the United States, the right or the conservative leaning party has sort of been able to co-opt the American flag. So the Republican Party tends to revere the American flag, and so when people are shown the American flag right before they vote, it can actually push people to be slightly more conservative. So again, it's just activating these thoughts, and people are going along with those thoughts that have been activated. They also shape how we construe social issues. So big problems that we're trying to solve, we use social representations to think about what the solutions might be, as we just saw in the talk that Stefan gave. So a lot of times policies depend on the metaphors that are being used. So there was a great study looking at whether crime is thought of as a wild animal or a disease spreading. So the way that you frame what crime is, that will dictate what people think the solution should be. So should you lock people up or should you prevent it from happening? And this is especially true when you have self-relevant motives. If somehow your sense of self is tied up into the social representation, you will have more motivation to act on it according to that social representation. So in one study by Landau and some of his colleagues, he used the metaphor of the United States as a body for some participants, and for some he didn't use a metaphor. And then he also talked in what participants thought was a separate study about bacteria either being harmful or not harmful. And what he found was that when people were thinking of the US as a body and they had just been reading about how bacteria is really harmful to your body, they were really anti-immigrant. And so, Mark Landau says this is because people were thinking of this metaphor as very self-relevant, right? They're thinking of themselves as the body. But I was also thinking bacteria is a very specific metaphor that we tend to use for outgroups. There are a lot of studies showing that we think of outgroups as contagions, as they're coming in and they're bringing disease, as we've seen with Vicky's work. And so I don't think it was a coincidence that they decided to use bacteria, because it's actually activating two things, right? That immigrants are dirty and bring disease and things like that, and the US as your body that could potentially get sick or suffer horrible consequences. So in my work, I started to look at representations of illegal immigration. This is well before Trump even announced his campaign. I was already thinking about this. And I started to look at political cartoons. So in the US, we often see the country portrayed as the Statue of Liberty, and she's just being overrun, either by a wave of illegal aliens, just massive amounts of people crossing the border, using words like invasion, and something that looks kind of like maybe small animals coming up onto you, right, and being unwanted. So I started to notice a little bit of a pattern, and I also noticed that there was some language, things like invasion, that were being used. So Trump was not the first person to talk about immigration, although he will say that he was. This is Tennessee State Senator Currie Todd, who I believe is still a state senator in Tennessee. He was asking questions about a program for women who are expecting. So they're pregnant and they go to a clinic and get free health care for their unborn baby. And his question was, what if they're undocumented? Or I think he said illegal. And the people running the clinic said it doesn't matter because the babies are the ones we're treating and they're in the US, they're going to be born here, so they're by default American citizens. And so he said, well, they can go out there and multiply like rats then. He eventually apologized and said that he should have used the term anchor babies, but I'm not quite sure how that fits into his statement, but that's what he said. So we're starting to see certain language, certain images. In 2010, we saw a rash. I believe someone had a map of all of the various laws that came into place about, you can't have water in your apartment or home unless you prove your citizenship. Some people were not renting at all to people who could not prove their citizenship. So a lot of policies started to pop up trying to exclude or oust people who may not be citizens. So in order to dig deeper, I left psychology for a little while and looked at linguistics and found that there are actually really dominant metaphors for immigrants, not just in the US, not just in North America, and not even just now. So they've been around for a long time in a lot of countries that have had immigrants coming in. So one of the most prevalent is thinking of immigrants or immigration as water. So they're coming in waves, they're coming in tides. We even saw with the Statue of Liberty being overtaken by a tsunami. We see lots of words having to do with war. So they're invading, they're attacking, they're fighting us, things like that. Animal words, so stampede, swarm. One of the ones that has been used in the Trump campaign a lot is round up. We're going to round them up and deport them. We also see immigrants or immigration seen as a pollutant. So it's coming, it's damaging our air, our water, things like that. And then, of course, we see that our United States or whatever the host country is looked at as a home, and it should be protected from this invasion or this water or this animal. So as I started to look at all of these metaphors, I thought, well, if you put them all together, if you think about what is something that might come in large numbers in waves, that's invading, that's a type of animal, that's dirty, that really leads you to one kind of animal, and that's vermin, right? If you put all of them together, you actually pick up on this one specific social representation. And just to put everyone on the same page, the definition of vermin are animals that invade foodstuffs and that tend to carry disease. So they're coming in big numbers, taking our stuff, and making us sick. And they're pests to be eradicated. We do not have conversations with vermin. We do not ask them nicely to assimilate. We say, go away. We don't want you here. So I thought maybe if this is the case, that these metaphors are activating thoughts of vermin, this might be why we're seeing support for very harsh policies to get rid of immigrants as opposed to having them assimilate or something less harsh. So I also wanted to talk really quickly about the emotion that is usually tied to vermin. So I apologize because some people have a very strong reaction to this picture, and that reaction is usually disgust. So Ravini talked a little bit about the model of, certain emotions lead to certain actions. And so disgust, we know, is a very strong emotion. And it's usually a physiological response to some stimulus that's gross, basically, like rotting food. And it's a very basic emotion. It's an adaptation for survival. We don't want to eat things that have been rotting because they can make us sick or even kill us. But this emotion has been hijacked for morality. So the same feeling of disgust that we might feel when we see a rat nest is very similar, if not the same emotion that we feel for a group that we feel is immoral. So the emotion is basically the same. So Hodson and Costello say, disgust reactions connote the sense that one is better, purer, and less offensive than the offending target. So if it's the case that we are seeing metaphors in social representations that liken immigrants to vermin, then we might see a disgust response, and we might see support for expulsion types of policies. So I just did this because I like to be fancy. So if vermin, activate disgust, and vermin are being likened to illegal immigrants, then we should see disgust follow. And because of that, we should see the support for expulsion policies. But if we think back to, metaphors being self-relevant, it should also be the case that these metaphors of vermin should be particularly salient or effective for people who have a very high identity with their country. So in my country, Americans. So I'm going to test all of these things together. All right, in study one, I just wanted to see if all of these metaphors put together actually do activate thoughts of vermin. And simultaneously, I wanted to see, do people already recognize these metaphors as the ones that we use for illegal immigrants? So I had 40 participants, most of them white, and they were recruited online. They actually did this for free. So sometimes they do. They do it for free. So they read the following passage, which I put together, just putting some of these metaphors together. They have invaded our house, coming in floods that we've been unable to stop. They'll take over the whole thing if we don't do something soon. Anything they come into contact with has been damaged, and now their many offspring are becoming another burden to deal with. We need to round them up and get rid of them. So I've highlighted the metaphors that I've put into this short passage. So half of the participants were told or asked, what animal is this person referring to? Clearly it doesn't have an animal or a person. And the second half were asked, what social group is this person referring to? So they just had to type something in, and that was pretty much it. So 21 people responded to the animal question. 20 responded with some type of vermin. So rats, mice, bed bugs, termites, insects. I don't remember what the last person said. But this is highly significant. People are basically saying, yeah, this is vermin. There's really no other animal it could be. As someone told me, well, it's not buffalo. I was like, you're right. It's not buffalo. Okay, so for those participants who were asked about the social group, there were 19 of them. 12 responded with immigrants or Mexicans. So specific answers were illegal immigrants, aliens, or Mexicans. So this was also significant. It was more than half. I had one person. So I had no other response given more than one. So everything else was just some one-off answer. My favorite, though, was kids who moved back home after college. That person had some stuff they should work through. But this still supports, right, the idea that these metaphors are A, combining to point to one type of animal, and B, we're already accustomed to seeing these types of metaphors for a certain group, illegal immigrants, at least in the US. So in the second study, I wanted to see if I could actually measure disgust, if I could get people to feel more disgusted if they read something that had these vermin metaphors. So we had 51 self-identified white Americans, slightly more women, and they read a news article on illegal immigration. So this time they're reading something that they know is about illegal immigration, and it used one version had these vermin metaphors, the other version did not. I'll show you that in just a second. And then we had a disgust measure, which Stefan also mentioned. So this is the perceived vulnerability to disgust. It has a subscale called the German version subscale. So this is questions like, I prefer to wash my hands pretty soon after shaking someone's hand. So this is kind of like the icky factor. And this is normally used as an individual difference measure to predict something. So to use it as an outcome measure is a little iffy because it's pretty hard to move. People already have their certain level of how averse they are to germs. I also measured American identity with items like being an American is an important reflection of who I am. I did measure political ideology as well to see if it predicted above and beyond my variables. So here is the version with the metaphors. So it looks like it came out of New York Times or something. So we see things like cracks at the border. We use that great word offspring. They're coming in swarms. They're scurrying across the border, coming in waves, and the floor is going to fall out from under us. The control version simply didn't have metaphors. So it just used very objective language. So instead of cracks at the border, we had entries at the border. Instead of offspring, children. Instead of scurry, hurry, coming in big numbers, things like that. So I'm just getting rid of metaphors that might already be in the media that we're exposed to. So what I'm going to show you here is people's level of disgust. The red line will be those who saw the vermin metaphors, and we're looking at whether this is related to American identity. So for those who read a short article that had these vermin metaphors, there's a clear relationship between how identified you are as an American and whether you actually feel disgust in the moments after reading this particular article. For the control article, we don't see a relationship. So people are not disgusted at the thought of illegal immigrants per se, but at the language that is being used to describe illegal immigrants. So that interaction is also significant. All right, so in this last study I'll present, I wanted to see how this relates to harsh policies. So I had 114 white Americans also read some articles, half women. So you already saw the articles that I talked about, same thing, except now they're filling out a policy measure. And these were based on the policies that we saw springing up across the country. So things like officers should be able to check for citizenship in case an individual appears illegal. So that was SB 1070 in Arizona, which was copied in other states. And then a reverse coded item like landlords should rent a residence to someone even if he or she cannot show documentation of their citizenship. So I'm trying to see if these vermin metaphors also lead to support for these expulsory policies. So I measured American identity again, as well as political ideology. I should say in the last study, political ideology did not do anything. It was just there, hanging out. But American identity did do a lot. Okay, so we're going to see level of support for the harsh policy. So for those participants who read the article that had the vermin metaphors, we see a relationship. So the more you identify as being American, the more you support policies that are basically expulsory. They're putting people out to the fringes or taking them out of the country illegally. We don't see that relationship when it's the control version. I do get questions on this graph why that yellow bar is slightly higher. When you get online participants, they tend to be pretty liberal. So I meant to check the means before I presented, and I did not. But usually we don't get people who are at the very end of high American identity. So I would predict that if we could get more participants higher on the end, we would see that line would just continue to go up. It's a relationship between the two variables. And so that interaction is also significant. I've tried to run studies where I measure disgust first and then policy second, so I can see if there's a mediation, but it does not mediate. So I'm not sure if these are two separate reactions that people are having. If I should use a different disgust measure that might be a little bit more sensitive, since the one I'm using is usually used for individual differences, or if people kind of get their disgust out once they fill that out, and then it's sort of muted for the policy questions. But I have seen this effect even in those studies when the mediation doesn't quite work out. All right, so what can we conclude? All right, social representations may play an important role in political beliefs. I think that metaphors are not usually given their fair credit at how much they can influence what we believe is right and good. And in this case, I think, as we move into an age where a politician has on average 9 seconds on some program to get their message across, they are relying on metaphors, on mottos, on quick sayings that can get their message across very quickly without any sort of real evidence or in-depth analysis. So in this particular case, it could be that people are becoming disgusted as they read these types of articles, but they're not really sure why. And then it may come out in the way that they feel towards immigrants. And policy support may be an effective language, not necessarily how people feel about the objective information, as we talked about with Adriana saying, they don't take our jobs, but somehow that is not what people believe. There's been a movement in the Associated Press to rid any articles having to do with illegal immigration of the word illegal. That does not seem to really be the problem. At least if you're thinking the problem is people are making decisions about policy based on, a feeling that's coming out of the metaphors. So in the future, I would like to look at the effect of positive metaphors. So in Mark Landau's study, where he looked at bacteria and the U.S. as a body, he had a condition where bacteria were just referred to as innocuous. Bacteria are just hanging out. They're not really doing anything bad to you. And he didn't report it, but I noticed, he didn't really talk about it in the paper, but I noticed that in that condition, people were very unsupportive of harsh policies towards immigrants. And so it could be that if we use different metaphors, we could get people to think about groups in a different light. I also wanted to see if metaphors will affect a new unknown group. So, I run into the problem that people already know these metaphors for this group. So it could be amplifying an effect that's already there. I want to see, does it work for the first time that you hear or read about a certain group? And then the difference in metaphors from different sources. So somebody earlier was asking the question, what about who says, right? Whatever about this particular group. Yeah, I think that's going to have an effect. Where you read it or who says it will definitely have an effect on how much this might affect your own views on policies or social groups or racial groups, etc. So with that, I want to thank Dr. Janessa Shapiro at UCLA. She was my postdoc advisor, and she really pushed me to do this research because I was like, I have this really weird idea. And she was like, you should do it. Okay. And with her Social Identity and Social Stigma Lab, I am now at Nevada State College, where I have my own undergraduate lab, and they have helped me as well. And of course, I really can't say how much I love this conference. I'm currently at a teaching institution, which I love. I have a 4-4 load, but I am the only social psychologist there. And so it gets a little lonely sometimes. So this has been really nice and made me think really deep and hard thoughts about my research and make me motivated to keep going with it and see how far we can get. So thank you very much.